And welcome back to another Critter Miss special. It is the 10s, the 30th to be precise, of Critter Miss. So whenever we hit those marks, we put away the role-playing game books and we talk about different aspects of gaming culture. So the first time that we did this, we talked about the problem with GURPS. The second time that we did this, we talked about what a trial-by-fire storyteller is and how you should avoid that trend. So this time, we're actually going to look at a phenomenon in gaming culture that really isn't seen in other aspects of culture as well. And the big question here is, why isn't there a competitor to match the cultural impact of Dungeons & Dragons? In particular, why isn't there a sci-fi competitor that is equal to Dungeons & Dragons?
Life's tough
When you're an NPC,
life's rough.
when you depend on me,
To give you weapons, items, armor, information for your journey, and still you just bullshit and try to hurt me. Life's tough
when you're an NPC,
life's rough.
I'm going to start this video off by saying that there are very little debates that are closed for discussion in the gaming community. Us nerds can argue forever about anything, about the quality of games, which games you prefer, which dice systems you prefer, which ones you think are better, which ones you think are worse. You know, the list goes on and on as far as that is concerned. But one of the areas that really is closed for debate is that there is no game that has reached the popularity or cultural impact of Dungeons & Dragons. You can have games you can like better than D&D. Hell, I tend to enjoy playing World of Darkness before I pick up a fantasy epic. But all things considered, even though you may like a game more or think it's better put together, Dungeons & Dragons has the cultural stock. Anyone who isn't a World of Darkness fan or has a friend who is a World of Darkness fan probably doesn't even know that Vampire the Masquerade exists. But when it comes to D&D, everyone knows what D&D is. Everyone is aware of its existence, and whenever you see jokes and memes about RPG players, it is with Dungeons & Dragons. Whenever an RPG comes into play in a television show, a movie, or so forth, it is typically Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is the sun to which all other RPGs orbit around. There are plenty of reasons for this, the most obvious being that D&D is the alpha. It is the first mainstream game to be created, produced, and distributed to a wide audience. It created the concept of the cool-looking dice that are a staple of nerd culture. It spawned a different subgenre of gaming and truly expanded upon the idea of building your own adventure and your own story. Combined with the fact that it is based on the Lord of the Rings, the fantasy epic icon, D&D easily takes the top spot. Since its creation, D&D has been the game. It is the game that anyone can name. Whenever you talk to your non-nerd initiated mother, or whenever you talk to your non-nerd friend, and you say, name a role-playing game, odds are they're going to name Dungeons & Dragons as the first thing that comes up. Soon followed, you'll get your games that actually had video games, like Vampire the Masquerade or Shadowrun, or that very brief period in time whenever Pathfinder gave D&D a run for its money. But honestly, D&D is the one that's known throughout the world. But why is that? Why has Dungeons & Dragons taken the #1 spot and stayed there? It is easy to say that it was the first, or it has the Lord of the Rings behind it. But just because something is the first doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the most memorable, or even the most beloved. Most cultural areas have seen multiple companies and entities spring forth that are on equal footing or even surpass the original product. Especially whenever you consider the fact that whenever it comes to subgenres of culture that you see for movies, TV shows, books, so forth, fantasy is a very popular subgenre. Yes, that's true. But you know what else is really popular? Science fucking fiction. It's the old argument of what you decide to play when you were a kid. Do you want to be a starfighter or a brave knight? Or a pirate? Or a cowboy? Or a space cowboy? Or a gangster of... Alright, you know what? This analogy's getting out of hand. The point is, science fiction is one of those genres that's definitely on par or even surpasses fantasy in terms of cultural popularity. So if we're going to consider Lord of the Rings, let's talk about another trilogy. Star Wars. Or you know what? How about let's throw in Star Trek as well? Or Firefly or Battlestar Galactica, all these really cool science fiction genres, movies, television shows, video games. I mean, the list goes on and on. Myself personally, I have always been a fan of science fiction over fantasy. And yet, as far as role-playing games are concerned, fantasy kicks the shit out of science fiction, and it's because of D&D. I mean, the argument not necessarily is why is D&D so popular. It's obvious why it's popular. The real question is, why hasn't anyone even come close to competing with it? It is certainly no easy task, and one that could have several answers to it. But the entire purpose of this video is to tackle that very question. Why is it that a science fiction equivalent did not come to be that was on par with, or even further surpassed, the cultural impact of Dungeons and Dragons? And yes, Star Wars games, Shadowrun, and so forth do exist, and they are popular. But let's be honest here, they may kick the shit out of D&D in your book, or my book, or other people's books, but they really can't compete when it comes to the cultural surroundings of Dungeons & Dragons. What are some reasons? I mean, there are some obvious reasons, such as the fact that whenever you think of Star Wars, you probably instantly think of the movies or television shows before you think of the RPG, but whenever you hear D&D, you go straight to D&D. But how about this as a good way to really start it off? Whenever it comes to genres, and subgenres within those genres, fantasy tends to be very concise, very parsimonious. You don't see a lot of branching when it comes to fantasy. With science fiction, there is a plethora of branching off. There are subcategories upon subcategories to the point where the whole thing dilutes the product, to the point where science fiction is just one gigantic umbrella term. When it comes to fantasy, there isn't a lot of divergence from the Lord of the Rings D&D concept. It is more of a matter of how much fantasy do you want in your Middle Ages setting. Do you just want knights, or do you want dragons? Do you want just the human races, or would you like elves, dwarves, halflings, and so forth? Do you want monsters or not? Do you want magic or not? It is relatively connected, and a lot of the aspects being modular would definitely be the term. You insert what you want wherever you want to a very core concept. Science fiction? Holy hell, where do we even begin? Whenever you compare two different subsections, like comparing a space opera to steampunk, or to cyberpunk, then comparing to just two fantasies, yeah, the change is huge. Just compare the Proto-Men to Steam-Powered Giraffe as two bands that are both science fiction based, yet widely different on how they handle their mythos. Musical name drop. Okay, maybe a little too obscure for those who are not a fan of those bands, so let's keep it mainstream and compare Star Wars to the movie Minority Report. Two wildly different entities, yet both in the same umbrella genre. Now let's compare Game of Thrones to Lord of the Rings. Definite differences, but not a far stretch, all things considered. This definitely coincides with the second part of a lot of gamers don't like to venture out of their comfort zones. So, whenever you're venturing, let's say, from the Game of Thrones world to the D&D world, not a far leap. Adventuring from the Star Wars world to Shadowrun, that's a very big jump. I am not saying that everyone is afraid to venture out and see what games are out there, or that they aren't willing to play other games. But everyone has their favorites. Nothing wrong with that, it's just what happens. When your favorite thing is fantasy, there isn't far stretch from D&D to Thieves' World or to Game of Thrones and so forth. But when your favorite game is Shadowrun, and you are asked to play a Star Wars game, or Tefra the steampunk game, or Space Pirates the musical, yeah, it's a bit farther whenever you're talking about the jump. This little nest egg also does not help whenever you talk about the fact that the majority of extremely popular science fiction role-playing games are byproducts of pre-existing movies, television shows, video games, and so forth. Yes, D&D is inspired by Lord of the Rings, but it is still its own entity, with its own mythos and its own universe. But when it comes to the most popular science fiction, Well, the majority of the games are games that are pre-existing movies, TV shows, or books. Star Wars, Firefly, Star Trek, Babylon 5, Battlestar Galactica, and so forth. These games are popular among their respective fan bases, especially Star Wars. But one of these things that makes D&D so tantalizing is the fact that you aren't bound to any pre-existing story, and if you aren't a fan of the source material, you can still have a fun time without being the odd man out. So how does this tie in with fans? Well, typically speaking, a lot of nerds like to stick to their own communities. Star Wars nerds like to be with their Star Wars nerds, and so forth. So whenever you have the fact that the sci-fi genre is so sparsed out, whenever you have so many fans that don't want to leave their own genres, it's very easy to see why science fiction loses out. It's mainly because that people don't want the science fiction equivalent to D&D. They want to play their Star Wars, they want to play their Firefly, and they just want to call it a day from there. But as it stands, people just don't want to adventure away from what makes them comfortable. And considering the fact that variety is the spice of life, I doubt there will be a game that comes along to take the top spot away from the minor comfort zones of everybody else. Who knows, maybe one day we will see the sci-fi equivalent to D&D. But considering the massive subgenres, the already massive cultural popularity of D&D, considering the fact that people don't want to adventure outside their comfort zones, I doubt it's ever going to happen. D&D is number one, and everyone else has to fall in line behind them. Either way, I hope that you liked this video. Please, if you did, like and subscribe. Also comment below on your feelings towards the sci-fi D&D, or if you had an idea that could potentially champion it. And please, go check out Project Derailed and TannerReviews.com for more. Thank you so much. Have a good day.